Concerned about something. One of my colleagues opened an attachment because he thought it was sent by the group.
Can you give me some details? Has anyone else opened it where you are?
It looks very much like our network's been attacked over here.
Oui, effectivement, vous n'êtes pas les seuls, ne touchez plus à rien.
Dans mon dossier, mais plus accéder au contenu. Plus accès à rien. Vous m'entendez?
We've no idea what to do here.
That's the kind of situation you don't want to live in any case while facing a crisis, and the deal is how to be prepared. My name is Arnaud Lautier. I'm a consultant in crisis management within Orange Cyberdefense. I've been doing crisis management for over 10 years now, and more specifically in cyber for the 5 last years. I'm accompanied by Steven de Munter.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Steven de Munter. I worked for over 20 years with the Belgian Federal Judicial Police with the computer crime unit, and now I'm over 3 years working for Orange Cyberdefense, more specific as an incident response manager and also a GRC consultant. So I'm taking my experience I have from police towards helping companies to react towards an incident.
Our agenda for today will be in 4 parts. First, a small and quick introduction in what is a crisis. The second part will be on how and why we need to involve all the main stakeholders within a company. Third part will be how basically to be prepared to face a crisis, and mostly a cyber crisis. And I will give you a quick example on a major crisis exercise we have organized for a client called Veolia.
So, as you can see, incidents are happening all around us every day, every moment, and as a crisis management, you need to react to them. Some of these crises you see here on the page, I've lived on a personal basis. Some of them I've worked on a professional basis, so I know how it feels to be in a crisis, and I know how it feels to have to work with a crisis.
The importance in understanding what is a crisis is basically that a crisis can happen anytime, anywhere, and that a crisis has huge impacts and are the most probable for a company. So for doing that, you need to evaluate, qualify within your company what is a crisis. Is a crisis due to your business as a company? Is it a crisis due to the country where you are? Is it due to geopolitics? Whatever the risks are, you need to properly evaluate your main scenarios to define what is a crisis for you. Different scenarios of crisis that we weren't ready for example, is the major pandemic we've lived through for the 2 and 3 past years. And most recently, for example, the war in Ukraine, that some companies in the world have been impacted directly. The risk zero doesn't exist when we talk about crisis. Therefore, whatever your company is, as small as it is or as big as it is, one day or another, you will face a crisis. So you need to be prepared. So for that, while thinking on how you need to be prepared to face a crisis, you need to have all the main stakeholders involved in this journey.
Now, during a crisis, I often come across 3 kinds of roles. You have your board members, your C-levels, people who will be taking decisions. You have your CISO and his CISO officers, and you have your IT experts. Now, for a CISO, because sometimes I'm also a CISO at companies, I will start with the most important person. The main challenge for them is to bring the awareness towards a board level and make sure that they know how to anticipate and to mitigate the risks that are for a company. He also needs to guide and help the C-level to take the right decisions and guide them with the right information when they got information. And he also needs to give them the right facts, data, and options. C-levels will have a responsibility to make sure that the company is ready to respond to a crisis. They need to minimize the impact, minimize the pain. I always say for a company, time equals money, and the more times it takes, the more money it will cost, the more it will hurt a C-level, because they always think about numbers and figures. But they will need to have to take certain decisions at the right time and at the right moment, and often they forget to involve their stakeholders. A lot of companies are these days connected to a lot of other companies, and their crisis might have an impact towards their clients, and they can't forget their clients. And then last but not least are our experts, our IT managers, our SOC managers, our CSOC managers. Their main task is to be prepared, to have the right people, the right processes, and the right tools already in their rucksack to prepare for an incident. Because their main goal is to get us back to normal business as possible.
Having all those people on board is one part of the job. The next, as you may have understood, is impacts. Impacts are of different nature when we talk about crisis management, and mostly of cyber crisis management. Impacts can be direct, indirect, due to the fact that a crisis in cyber can last several weeks, several months. You need to understand, of course, the main and first impacts, but you need to see on the long run what may be the impacts for your company. Because at the end of the day, it's the question on, is your company ready and prepared to survive? Because for small companies, it's that question that at the end of the day, they will ask themselves. Are we capable of tomorrow survive a crisis? It's also a question on what are the main impacts for you as a company. You have different natures of impacts. Impacts, of course, that are on your network, on IT. It's a cyber crisis. But you need to see and understand that you may have impacts on your operations, depending on your sector of activity. It's also impacts on your reputation, your image, that can have a huge effect on the finances of the company, having clients or potential clients not wanting to work with you anymore. It's also a question of resources, human factor. Tomorrow you're unable to work for several weeks, several months, your employees won't be able to work. So it's a loss for them, and of course a loss for you. So thinking about the impacts at the very first step of thinking about what would be your crisis management organization is vital for you.
And having these kinds of impacts will also have a direct link to possible fines. A lot of companies will fall under the NIS2 directive, but also have to be GDPR compliant. Or often companies forget to communicate. I've talked about it earlier. You have to communicate with your stakeholders. But as a company, if you're in a crisis, don't forget, these days we all have a small device in our pocket, smartphone. As soon as it's on Twitter, it's out there, and you no longer control the narrative. As if you're in a crisis, although you're in a crisis and you don't think you have time, keep on communicating, keep on controlling the narrative, show that you were ready to deal with this kind of impact.
But how to think about the impacts on your company? Well, that's the journey on how to be prepared for tomorrow. As you may all know, a crisis, it's three main steps. The before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis. Before the crisis, it's only a question on preparation. That's the main and the most important step while thinking about crisis and crisis management organization. During the crisis, that's how you will manage your crisis. And of course, the last one, but not least, it's after the crisis, and that's how to recover, but also how to think your company for tomorrow to avoid as much as possible any crisis, and if not, how to minimize as much as possible the impacts on your company. So being prepared. Three main steps, very simple. It's finding the proper organization, having the right processes, the right documentations, the right tools, basically. It's also having the right people identified to be key members of your crisis management organization. But working on crisis, it's not your daily work. You have other jobs. So those people that have been identified, they need to understand how they will work during a crisis. They need to understand what are their role and responsibilities during a crisis. And the third key point is basically that a crisis management organization needs to be updated frequently. For one and simple reason is that, as you have seen in the last 3 to 4 years, our world has been moving very fast, and keeping your crisis management organization as it is without touching it, without updating it, if in 2 years, 3 years you have a crisis and you didn't do anything about it, meanwhile, your crisis management organization isn't useful at all. But to help you, you need to go through different steps to prepare your company for that matter. The idea here is that whether your company has already a crisis management organization or that you need to implement a crisis management organization, its steps, the first steps are very based on theory. It's a work that needs to be done, but you don't know if the end result will be the right one. So for that matter, the two last steps you have, awareness and training sessions and crisis exercises, will be the two main factors for you to understand if the people you have identified have understood properly your crisis management organization and what will be their function during a crisis. And the crisis exercise will be there to validate that the organization you thought about is the proper one and that the documentation that has been produced is the right one and is useful in terms of operations during a crisis, and if everybody has understood what they need to do during a crisis.
Yes, so sometimes when we show these slides to C-levels, they can't really grasp it, and then I tell to them, every year you organize a fire drill. It's the same. You organize a fire drill because people will know what to do, they know their proper roles and responsibilities. You will see, okay, where are the bottlenecks? Okay, did we forget to open certain doors? Or are there certain issues, are there not fire extinguishers? And they will have to translate that towards a cyber incident. And then as soon as they can grasp that material, they are completely on board with it.
But that's only steps that are useful at first. But what will be very useful for your company to understand how they may evolve with their current situation and the world we live in, they need to update it. Update is a very important part of your crisis management organization. Why? Because maybe your organization has evolved in the sense that maybe you have new companies within your group. It's because your country law has changed and has obliged you to have a crisis management organization put in place. It's because you are in a sector of activity that is regulated, such as finances and insurance. Or it's because you went through a simple crisis management exercise and you saw that you had some flaws and that you need to improve your organization. All that will help you on the next step, which is during the crisis. During the crisis, and mostly in cyber crisis, there are key points to have in mind. The first one is that you will have to support your top management because cyber isn't their forte. They need to really understand and grasp what they will have to do facing a cyber crisis, but IT will have the need to have support from the top management because some decisions are very strategic. The main example on this one is basically network. The decision has to be to cut the network. People may think that it's a CIO decision because it's technical. But as a matter of fact, it's a strategic decision because you cut the network, you cut all your activities. That's the board members that need to decide such things. The other things that have to be kept in mind is, of course, to contain your crisis. Investigate, because you don't know how much time basically the cyber attack has occurred. But it's also thinking how you will manage properly your crisis, take the right decisions at the right time, but it's also thinking how you will have to recover from it. And that point is from the very beginning of your crisis, how you will recover afterwards. And the last one is to adapt on the threat and focus on the after. So something that you will all understand and have seen in the past is basically the main steps of a crisis. The first point is an event. An event can be seen and foreseen by different actors, employees, partners, clients, service providers, authorities. And they will come to you and say, there's something strange, you need to have a look, because we don't know how and what is the extent of that event. So the first thing to do is then to qualify the event. Is it an incident? Is it a crisis? As both terms and knowledge and theory aren't the same. An incident can be managed every day by teams that have been already in place, whereas a crisis is a very specific organization that will support the company while facing huge impacts. Evaluating the event and qualifying the event will push you to mobilize different actors. The idea here is not to mobilize all your crisis units and all the people that are members of those crisis units, but to identify the proper people and the proper crisis units that will be useful at that moment, at that precise moment, for managing your crisis. It can be operational crisis units, it can be your decisional crisis unit that are built with your board members or your ex-com members. And while mobilizing, the idea is to start thinking on what is the real reason, what is the root cause of your crisis. And then we enter the real thing, the real management of your crisis. The idea here is basically to identify the best decision at the proper time with the best people that can advise you and bring a whole strategic on how to manage your crisis and how to recover from it. So as Steven mentioned, there's a lot of communication that involves any kind of crisis, and it's even more necessary when we talk about cyber. But it's also a question on relationships with the authorities. As all companies in the European Union, when there's a data breach, you need in the 72 hours to inform the authorities and inform the clients. So that's why there's a huge work to prepare your company in facing a crisis, because there's a lot of stakeholders involved. And the idea is that through this strategy that has been defined on how managing your crisis and how to come out of it, it's of course to end your crisis. And in cyber, it's quite tricky, as you all know, because it's difficult to understand if the cyber attack is over, if your cyber attackers aren't anymore on your network. Compared to any other kind of crisis, I mean, a fire of a data center, the crisis we know, it's when your data center is over, is burned, you have to rebuild it. A cyber crisis, it's way difficult to identify the real border on when it's over. That's why there's a decision to be taken by the top management and say, okay, we feel it's over, possible, but we need to still monitor in case that something happens and we need to come back into a crisis mode. Monitoring is very important when we talk about the end of a crisis.
And during a crisis, especially the second and the third step are very hard because you're in a panic situation. And when we go into a panic, we all fall back towards our lizard brain. And we have three options: fight, flight, or freeze. And I think as IT professionals, we only have one option, and we have to fight. But if we don't know how to fight, a lot of times we will make the wrong decisions. So it's important, I always say, that you train these kind of exercises on a regular basis, that they, for your teams, become a kind of a muscle memory, that everybody knows what to do, how to do, and when to do it.
But what will happen after the crisis is the return of experience. Think about what needs to be improved. Of course, things went well, but the main task is really to do an introspection on what happened, how things went, what was the root cause to avoid that tomorrow morning you can have the same kind of crisis. And therefore, there's a real work on doing that return of experience. There are two main keys on doing that return of experience in cyber. There's the governance side of things, so basically updating what needs to be updated. Your organization, you saw that there were some flaws. You saw that documentation that was considered to be operational for a crisis wasn't really used. You saw that in the crisis rooms, things were missing that could have helped people in the crisis units to work better. All that needs to be done to improve your organization. And exercises are the best way for you to improve yourselves instead of living a real crisis, because the impacts aren't the same and the future isn't the same either. Now, since we have 3 minutes left, I will talk about an example that is public for Orange Cyberdefense and our clients. It's a cyber crisis exercise we have performed in 2021, and it was for a French worldwide known group called Veolia. They asked Orange Cyberdefense to organize a crisis management exercise because even though they are used to do frequent crisis exercise by business unit or company, they never had done a crisis exercise on a group level involving multiple crisis units from different entities and different countries. So they had different objectives and / challenges. The idea for the top management was to understand what are the risks of a cyber crisis and to be prepared to face such events. It's also to test the coordination between the different crisis units, as it was the first exercise they have done with multiple crisis units. And it was, of course, as is always happened after an exercise, is to see where are the areas of improvement. For the group, it was really important while preparing the exercise to have multiple impacts evaluated. As you can see, we had six different impacts that we wanted to see. And the deal for the exercise was to have 3 main entities of the group involved, 2 companies and the group in 2 different countries. So we had 4 crisis units involved on a 1-day exercise that involved 64 clients, employees, and 16 consultants from our side. So be reassured, that's a top-notch exercise that has been performed because they are used to do way smaller exercises. But the main kind of exercise we perform for clients is basically 1 crisis unit on a half a day. So it's not as wide as this one, but it gives you an idea of what kind of exercises you may have in your companies in the future if necessary. What went out from this exercise are 3 main points. First, the awareness on the business impacts. What came out of the exercise is that the board members weren't really aware of precisely the activities of each of the companies that were involved in the exercise, and more, they weren't really aware of the cyber impacts on their own company. The second point that came out is that, of course, they saw differences between the group, how they were prepared on crisis management, and the other companies, which led to a conclusion that they needed to have a global think committee on how to improve their crisis management organization so that all the companies could be at the same level. And the last one is the experience. As I mentioned, it was the first exercise with multiple crisis units for a one-day exercise, and what came out is that basically they didn't communicate properly, they didn't exchange information as often as they should have, which led to misunderstandings, and they know that they need to strengthen that point also. All those actions came out through reports, and just to give you an idea how it went further for them, they had a huge kind of reorganization on their crisis management in 2022, and they asked us to perform at least 10 crisis management exercises this year for 10 different companies of the group, and they tend to do 60 exercises in total until 2024. So it's huge. That's a main example of a group that has means to do it. For smaller companies, of course, it's not the same capabilities of dealing with exercises, but what's sure is that any kind of company, whatever the means are, they need to be prepared. They need to do crisis management exercises. That will be all for Steven and me. Do you have any questions?
No, so yeah, I would like to thank you for your attendance. If you have any more questions and you're a bit shy, you can always come to our booth and ask them directly to us. We're happy to answer them. Thank you for your